Hello, and welcome to the Solano EDC Economic Update. My name is Bob Burris. I'm the President and CEO of the Solano Economic Development Corporation. And I want to welcome all of you to our third installment of our economic update with Robert Eyler and Chabin Concepts. These have been very valuable to the community and our watchers and listeners. And we're excited to hear what's happening in the economy. While I have the microphone, though, I'm very excited to also let everybody know that tomorrow we will be releasing our economic newsletter based on the EDD information coming out. So be looking out for that. We're also excited to work with Dr. Eyler on the Solano County Economic Index. So within the next month, you should be seeing a copy of that coming out for everybody's review and a presentation following. With that, I want to turn it over to our, of course, very distinguished guest, Dr. Eyler, an accomplished author, professor, and entrepreneur with economic forensics. So take it away, Dr. Eyler.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen now. Just confirm that you can see my screen. Bob, you can see it?
I can see it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So folks, what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through the national and state economy and provide some context about where Solano County may be going over the next 12 or 18 months, and also show you some specific pieces of data, and then talk a little bit at the end about the index of economic and community indicators that'll be coming out in partnership with the County of Solano here over the next month or so. Here's what is sort of top of mind with respect to economists right now. We've been looking at jobs since the beginning of the COVID-19 recession. So as of March 2021, the US economy's got about 6% unemployment, seasonally adjusted. New data will come out the first week of May in terms of what happened in April. 8.4 million people still out of work that had a job February 2020 in terms of the volume of workers. And that's at the national level. At the state level, we're going to get new data tomorrow, as Bob just said. But as of, and those data are incorrect, it's not August 2020, it's as of February 2021. But the key there is we've lost about 1.2 million jobs in California, seasonally adjusted, and Solano County is down to about 8.1% unemployment. Pretty much tracking the state, doing a little bit better than the state, but still about 12,400 people out of work since last February. So one of the things is we're seeing recovery momentum, but a big question I ask or get asked is what's happening with the forecast now? Because so much stuff is happening on almost a weekly basis, it's hard to keep up. And we'll talk about how those forecasts are evolving for the better, given another round of fiscal stimulus, continued lower interest rates, even with inflation starting to creep up a little bit. And I'll talk more about this later. As long as inflation is not unexpected, we should not expect financial and labor markets to really be shocked by inflation. We've got so much demand momentum building up and in our economy right now that we should expect prices to be creeping up. The key is whether they creep up in an unexpected way. So with that in mind, some of the things we're watching as economists and this sort of prevailing questions going over the next 12 or 18 months, we're hearing a lot coming out of Washington about another plan for spending that might be focused on infrastructure and financed by corporate tax increases. Will that pass and how will it work? We're not sure yet. We will see. There's a lot of rumblings about how it's going to play out, but that's something to watch going forward in terms of a jobs plan now coming out on top of what we can think of as more rescue financing over the last 3 rounds of fiscal stimulus. How interest rates and inflation play off of each other, that's something to watch in terms of trying to foresee how inflation expectations are affecting financial markets. Watch 10-year treasury rates, watch how the stock market, specifically the S&P 500, starts to react to rising rates depending on how they rise, and whether or not the Federal Reserve starts to hint that they're going to start raising that short-term rate, which can have kind of a confounding effect on longer-term rates depending on what's going on otherwise. But we know that those have got to rise at some point. It's a matter of them rising in ways that we did not expect and we couldn't make adjustments for quickly. Housing markets have also been a confounding situation in this recession, with the idea that we initially expected housing markets to take somewhat of a downturn, maybe not a strong one, but somewhat of a downturn. And we've actually seen them continue to rise in terms of median home price. The explanation for that I'll talk about in a little more detail in a minute. But generally speaking, the preservation of high income jobs and lower interest rates have fueled more housing demand. How long can that continue is a big question, but I'll show you a forecast in just a little bit, which is positive at least through the beginning of 2022. And then ultimately, we started with jobs. We're going to end with jobs in terms of thinking about the economy going forward. When are jobs going to come back to where we started 2020? And will there be structural change that leaves some workers behind? That's one of the biggest socioeconomic questions that's emerging as we're going from recession to recovery. And I'll show you some data that suggest where we're going to see some focus on that in just a minute. Well, let's start with the national picture through the end of March, with the idea that these data are, I'm going to show you the pre-Great Recession data first as we move from left to right on this graph to the latest data we have for the US. So this is the number of people that are temporarily unemployed in the United States on a monthly basis. And you can see that the period between January 2007 and really March 2020 was flat, basically in this sort of consistent, relatively well-functioning market after 2010 way, but then spiked as we saw employers tell people that we're going to let you go for right now. We're probably going to bring you back. And that, in a sense, defines somebody as temporarily unemployed. And then that faded relatively quickly over the middle of 2020 and then stabilized as we entered 2021. Now, that's different than the next one, which is permanently unemployed, which means my employer says, thank you for what you've done, but we're not going to bring you back and we're done with your job. You can now see easily the definition of the Great Recession on the left-hand side, that big blue hill that shows you how the large magnitude that was in the, let's say, mid 2008 to 2010 period, and then the slow recovery period back toward the beginning of 2020. And then we didn't really see that spike until April, May, June of 2020. So the temporary job losses happened first. Then we started to see more permanent job losses creep in. And we've seen them all flatten in terms of both temporarily and permanently unemployed people. But the proportion of the permanently unemployed has gotten larger. Now, why that's important is now if you go back to the left-hand side of the graph, the proportions of permanent and temporary unemployed generally are not one or the other. They usually walk somewhat hand in hand, and you can see that over that 13-year stretch. What we don't want to see is we don't want to see the blue area get bigger. Temporarily unemployed people are a little easier to rehire, and there's been some conversion of that gray area to the blue. The other way people become unemployed, to give us the full unemployment picture in the United States, is they become unemployed because they just completed a temporary job and now are looking for work again. They chose to quit. They re-entered the labor force after being out of it. And this has been somewhat controversial by the nature of how some folks have had to choose between work, unemployment benefits, childcare, home teaching because of their kids being home and not being able to physically go to school. And now as schools are reopening, we will see how large that light blue portion becomes as we see how many people were really out there making that choice explicitly. And these are new entrants to the labor force. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because when we think about how long it's going to take to recover from recession, a lot of it is built in on how that rainbow colored section on the far right-hand side shrinks over time. We expect the gray area to shrink. We need all those other colors to also consistently shrink down to have full recovery. Well, one of the reasons why recovery has started is because certain industries have hired back and basically gotten back to about the same capacity they started in 2020 with, but other industries have still seen some suffering, and whether or not that leads to structural change is something I'll talk about in a minute. But here are the industries at the national level, and this is April 2020 percentage change in jobs from 1 year previous. So think April 2019 to April 2020. And you can see on the far right-hand side some huge percentage changes, thinking that the maximum range of this is from 0 to 100% negative. So we're talking somewhere close to 50% loss in food services and drinking places, basically bars and restaurants, accommodation, the array of places to stay overnight, over 40% loss. Now that's April. Now by December, we saw recovery, even though accommodation, the travel industry's core, which is the overnight stay market, hotels, motels, bed and breakfast, et cetera, still suffering pretty well, over 30% job loss from the previous December, just a few months ago. Now here's January, February, and March. So we're starting to see more recovery momentum across all industries. You can see all these numbers, while still negative, are relatively small negative, especially versus the blue column, which was the beginning of the recession. But we're watching very closely about how bars, restaurants, and hotels come back, because we have a lot of lower wage workers, a lot of easy entry jobs in those areas, especially seasonal jobs that employ a lot of people and provide bridges over time during the calendar year with respect to getting income and not having income, or potentially being at school and not being at school. If you're an adult going to college, that's something to watch closely. And that's why I'm teeing up with this, because later we're going to talk about California in contrast and thinking about ultimately Solano County. To give another perspective on the job market recovery, I'm going to show you a graph that is meant to compare the Great Recession, which is the best recession comparison to the COVID-19 recession. Don't be thinking about the 1919 recession that was post-World War I or the Great Depression. The construction of those recessions were much different, not only how we entered them, even though you can make a claim that the 1919 one was somewhat affected by what happened with the Spanish flu. The nature of global integration and what happened the previous 4.5 years, it doesn't make any sense to make that kind of comparison. The Great Recession is the best one given the nature of the economy to date. Here's what the Great Recession looked like starting in November 2007 with a certain volume of jobs, which I made equal to 100, and then that bowl-shaped recovery over 78 months in a seasonally adjusted way to get just back to the same volume of workers we were at November 2007. So 78 months basically to just recover the lost jobs. Well, this is what the COVID-19 recession looks like, where as of March, we're 94.7% back to the number of jobs we had in January 2020. So that's 100 on the black line is the number of jobs we had in January 2020. And we need that black line to move up to the red dotted line to truly have recovery. And that's just recovery, not getting back to where we would have been if growth had taken place 2020 forward. So notice that we had sharp downturn, some big increase initially, but then some flattening, and now we're starting to speed up again. The summer and fall of 2020 is going to tell a lot of the tale in terms of how long it's going to take to finally get back up to that red dotted line. Generally speaking, though, forecasts are getting better. So if you take all the labor market data, even with some of those industries still lagging a little bit with respect to recovery, the overall economy is looking to be recovering relatively good speed over the next couple of years, and certainly over the next few quarters. Every quarter, the Philadelphia Federal Reserve does a survey of 40 forecasters. And those forecasters provide an array of forecast data that they're looking at for the American economy. I'm just showing you 2 of those data points. And in the first column, I'm showing you the previous quarter's forecast and then the new one, because you're going to see some contrast here. And this is typical of how economists have been dealing with the speed of change over the last 12 or 13 months, with the idea that we're basically adapting week by week what our forecasts are. This is the latest forecast, and I'm going to give you a warning here. This is actually just through the end of January. So some other things have happened, including the third round of fiscal stimulus. And so you've seen the Federal Reserve make adjustments to this forecast already, and I'll talk about this in a minute. And also the IMF come out and basically match the same forecast as the Federal Reserve's upgrade. But this is where they started in January 2021, thinking forward through the remainder of 2021. Notice that shaded area, those numbers are all greater except for the current quarter, which has now been upgraded to the previous quarter's forecast for the same timeline. That's the growth of inflation-adjusted income in the United States. And this is the evolution of the unemployment rate. Notice again, beating the previous quarter's estimates in each one of those slots. So one of the things that's happening is that we're getting better and better information and better news about the economy, the labor market, what fiscal and monetary policy are doing with respect to driving demand and hopefully driving rehiring. And we're seeing that play out in these forecasts. So this is all good news. This is the annual look. That 4.5 for this year was up from 4% the previous quarter, is now at 6.5%, that the Federal Reserve has upgraded that by 2 percentage points because of the largeness and the construction of the latest round of fiscal stimulus, and also what the Biden administration is trying to do by the end of this calendar year with getting an infrastructure plan going. We will see what actually happens when the first quarter data are fully synthesized and ultimately the entire year of 2021. But we should expect some moderate growth after this year once all that's in place, and it's going to take some time for all that money to actually move into the economy and have an ultimate effect. But it will support relatively positive growth, and notice each one of those numbers in the shaded area is greater than the previous quarter, and unemployment is going down at a faster clip all the way to the end of 2024. So 6 months ago, the prediction was we would not quite be back to 2020 unemployment numbers until the end of 2024. Now we're thinking it might be the end of 2023, and we might actually see that move up closer to the middle of 2022 relatively soon, depending on how we see the fiscal stimulus ultimately rolling out, the ability for interest rates to remain relatively low, and global growth get through the rest of this year, with the idea that we still have a sort of this fading but viable specter out there in terms of the variants of COVID-19 and how itchy the trigger will be if we start to see cases rise again in earnest. So, like I said, we have seen some rising forecasts here. The IMF picture, which is going to show you some international data now, just got released in early April. I outlined the US data, and you can see 6.4% on that second column of data that's in the shaded area, and then 3.5 for next year, basically the same as the data we just saw for the US from the Federal Reserve. But the key is that if you look at the rest of the world, more or less the rest of the advanced economies, China is not on this graph, but China has actually had positive growth in 2020s and expected to have a relatively robust 2021, all positive growth, all under the assumption we will not have a variant that upsets social policy in such a way that we can't stay open and in a sense continue to recover. Now, one question I get asked a lot is, when fiscal stimulus hits the street, how's it being utilized? Well, the New York Federal Reserve actually did a study and surveyed households about how they in fact are spending the money. And you can see here that in the first round of fiscal stimulus, which really started to hit the street in earnest in June 2020, it was relatively even how people spent the money, saved the money, and also reduced the amount of debt they have. So you can see that in the first numeric column there that's under the number 1. And you can see that the average percentage of the fiscal stimulus that they received, or the federal stimulus they received, was actually less than the other 2 slots. They actually saved or bought down debt more than they spent. The second round, the same, more saved as a proportion. And then the third round, they're expecting to do even more savings. So one of the good things about that picture is that it tells you that people may have learned from the Great Recession and, let's say, the exuberance of spending that took place in the first decade of the new millennium, and they're not doing it now. And some of that may be scarring from what happened after the Great Recession, and really trying to be careful, also recognizing that they just don't have enough certainty about the future. So it is good that that's happening. The one thing that we need to think about with those proportions moving more towards savings or buying down debt is, does that slow our recovery down once we get through this initial stage, because people are saving and not spending? Good for longer term growth, not great for short term growth. And most economists would tell you that it's better that we have a balance between consumption and savings rather than consuming ad infinitum. Now, one of the bright lights, and I'll come back and talk about housing, has been our equity markets. So if you are a participant in equity markets, it has been a pretty good time for you after April 2020. Between March 15 and April 30 was crazy. But once we hit the bottom in the S&P, and in most markets following the S&P, generally speaking, economists use the S&P as sort of their key indicator of what's going on in equity markets. Been on a real nice tear ever since. And in fact, it flirted up and down around 4,000 on this index. But if we look at this over the full 20 years of the data on this graph, here are the 3 recessions, including the one we're still currently in. And you can see that this is a different situation. The key is recognizing it's not so much we didn't lose value on the S&P, is the length of time we took between the loss and the eventual recovery. So you can see the dot-com recession, it took a while for the S&P to stumble down, but it lost a lot of its value on that tumble from the beginning of the year 2000 down to the bottom somewhere toward the end of 2002. Then we had a decent bull market, which looks completely dwarfed by what's happened since the Great Recession, to the peak before the Great Recession, another pretty sharp tumble. But this time, notice how compressed in time that equity market change was, and then the nice bull market ever since then. The preservation of high income jobs, where a lot of people are also participants in the equity markets and taking advantage of relatively low prices during that V-shaped cut that we see where the 2652 is, and our movement toward technology products that dominate the nature of how profits are made by the businesses that are a large portion of the S&P 500's portfolio of businesses that make up the 500. That's driving a lot of demand against supply. So that's why we continue to climb up, is because all the demand factors necessary are in place. Now, one thing that we are watching closely is what's going to happen with inflation and interest rates. And inflation has gotten a lot more focal light on it here over the last couple of months, because we have had expectations pick up, including business expectations that they're expecting prices to rise, not only in their supply chains, but what they're going to start charging for their goods and services. And that's starting to transmit to consumer inflation expectations rising. Now, if you look at one interest rate as a way of sort of gauging how that's going to play out ultimately in the bond markets, which can start to affect equity markets, but ultimately how we think about inflation risk, I tend to look at the 10-year Treasury rate. And that's, you see the recession here. These are from the end of the Great Recession, where the 10-year rate was actually relatively high. And it's hard for me to say that as an economist because we've been in such this weird low rate environment for so long that I look at 3.75% and say, wow, that was really high. It's nonsensical to say it that way, thinking more historically. But relatively speaking, over the last 10 or 11 years, we're at a relatively high point of the interest rates, and specifically the 10-year treasury earlier in the decade. And we've been slipping down ever since as policy completely took hold, and we just got more and more feeling that we're going to have recovery, but the recovery was going to be slow. So rates started to fall. We also had a lot of fiscal policy spending in 2009 that forced 10-year treasuries up, but then that faded as the economy showed it was going to recover more slowly than maybe we initially expected. You can see that, kind of wobbled around the same sort of number over years and years and years. Then the hard fall based on what the Federal Reserve did. But then notice at the far right-hand side, especially in the shaded area, starting to pick back up in those yields. Two things are happening there. One, fiscal stimulus being as robust as it is, bond markets have to bet that the US government's going to have to increase the rates they're offering on the bonds they're selling to finance fiscal stimulus to get the global markets to purchase them. It's supply and demand. And that has crept up yields. The second piece is with all the fiscal stimulus and lower interest rates otherwise into short-term markets, you should expect more consumption behavior to kick in once recovery is more obvious. More demand means higher prices, and higher prices means more inflation risk, and hence I need higher yield. So it's curled up that 10-year treasury yield a little bit. And here's the core CPI price movement through that same time period. So thinking about how those track each other, you can see a little bit of a lag. It's not a perfect tracking, and it's not meant to be, but it is at least a way of gauging what's going to be coming in terms of how markets are using information and then turning that into actual transactions. You can see on the far right-hand side, and it's a little tricky because for better or for worse, the blue and the black are following the exact same path for a little bit here. But you can see that quick pickup here after that little cut in the shaded area at the very far right-hand side on the black line. That is the pickup of inflation over the last couple of months that you've been hearing about in the news. Was that, in a sense, presaged by what would happen in the 10-year treasury? Partially. But the key is that as those start to creep up, we're going to watch them closely. It's the black line moving towards that dotted line where you might start to have to worry about Federal Reserve policy saying, okay, well, now we got to maybe start worrying about inflation a little bit. We need to creep up those rates. We will see how that plays. But this is something to watch in terms of the inflation picture. Okay, and then there's that little piece there at the end. Let's now talk about the labor data at the state level, some of the regional level, but also Solano County. So as of February 2021, these are the data. You can see the bolded area, which is the third and fourth numeric column here is Solano County, 8.1% unemployment, 12,400 people out of work, about 6.2% down from where we were 1 year before in February 2020. The labor force down about 2%, which could mean retirements. People have left Solano County and are now some other place in terms of being counted labor force. But if you look at San Francisco right next door to Solano County, you see some really weird dynamics, relatively low unemployment rate, a lot of change in terms of the people that live in San Francisco being out of work. And that's probably because there's been people that have left San Francisco and are counted some other place. So the volume of workers that were residents of San Francisco that were counted 1 year ago has changed and gone down. And the labor force number tells you that that's so, because it's down almost 7.5% from the previous year. Migration data have told us that people have left San Francisco. Whether that leaves a hole in the San Francisco economy that's going to take some time to heal, we will see. But these are the latest data, all suggesting recovery across the state with some nuances, specifically in places like San Francisco. As we discussed before, I'm going to show you the data for California at the industrial level, and you're going to see job losses. So here's April 2020 and December 2020, and that's really the beginnings of recovery. Then we have January, we gave some of that recovery momentum back, and then we have February, where it kind of flattened out a little bit, but at least got a little bit of recovery momentum back. Same story as the national level. Leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, hotels, the big suffering, 34% of jobs that were there the previous February 2020, not there for now as of the end of February 2020. We do expect that to pick up in the March data that come out tomorrow. You're likely to see some of those reflected in what Bob will send out from Solano EDC. Other services, places like fitness centers, hair salons, nail salons, where you're pretty close to your client, down pretty deeply as well. But those are lower wage job centers in terms of industries that hire people and relatively easy entry for workers to get jobs in those arenas, and also somewhat seasonal in the case of leisure and hospitality. We're watching that closely because one of the things that we're hearing from the Biden administration is they want to pick up incomes for folks that may be at lower income levels and don't have a lot of other opportunities in the economy. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Here's Solano County, same data, except now at the county level. But I'm going to walk you through each month since April, since the beginning of the recession to the latest data in February. Again, these data will be updated tomorrow. But there's April and May where most of the problems happen. Notice that the industries are very similar. Then June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So you can see that you're getting some recovery in some industries, not so much in others. You can actually see some positive aspects in transportation, warehousing, and utilities, basically around our evolution of consumption toward having home delivery and increasing the demand for jobs in logistics. There's January, and then there's February. So you can see that the data are somewhat similar to the state. There's some industries that recovered more quickly, some have recovered a little more slowly, but Solano County is basically following the state lead in a lot of these industries, doing slightly better in the aggregate. Now, one place we're also watching is on taxable sales, because one industry we're concerned about, and we'll see some nuancing here in a minute, is what's going to happen with brick and mortar retail. So this is a comparison, or the percentage change in taxable sales from the second quarter of 2020 to the second quarter of 2019, or the shock that really happened in the beginning of COVID-19. And then here's the third quarter, same story. So you look at this and notice that the negative numbers are pretty stark in specific types of retail. Even gas stations were low because we weren't driving around as much. We had two positive centers, which were building materials. Totally makes sense. People were at home, went to Home Depot, Lowe's, other places like that to do home projects. Food and beverage stores, we started shopping because we started eating at home more, eating out less. You can see food services and drinking places, bars and restaurants right next to the positive aspects of food and beverage stores, down sharply in restaurants and bars. But you can move to the far right-hand side. Notice other retail group, which I'm now going to shade. That is basically the online sales where we're collecting sales tax locally, but aren't necessarily representing brick and mortar businesses locally. So that's something to watch, is that, does that growth continue? Do we see some of those other columns pick back up above that red line over the next few quarters? This is really most of the pain happened in 2020. Quarter four was a good pickup in terms of seeing overall taxable sales pick up. The official data to be able to compare across the state haven't shown up yet from California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, but that should be coming soon. The key is that we're watching closely to see if these trends don't change, then rehiring in retail may take some time to come back. I talked about housing earlier. This is a housing forecast for all the counties of California. You can see California through February 22 is forecasted by Zillow to be about 5.7% growth at the median home price. There's no county in California that is going to be, at least right now, predicted to be less than zero growth, even though you look at the far right-hand side and you're seeing some Bay Area counties. Tuolumne is one that's not in the Bay Area, but Sonoma, Marin, San Francisco, San Mateo, and San Benito counties, as well as Santa Cruz and Santa Clara, most of the far right-hand side, relatively slow, concentrated on the Bay Area. Solano is about 3/4 of the way moving left to right, and I'm sorry I didn't mark that. If you can see my arrow, which you might be able to see, Solano County is right here at just a little bit over 5%. So when you think about median home prices, what's driving this continued, basically robust forecast, and also what just happened last year was relatively robust? What's driving that? Part of it, high income earners have remained in their jobs, low interest rates fueling the cost of credit, driving more demand, and the demand and supply conditions are moving toward excess demand. We haven't built enough homes to keep up with demand. We're seeing people move from rental to home ownership. And the issue is not so much in median home prices in the short term, is going to be in rental prices, especially if people are leaving rental to buy homes while the getting is good. Now, with that in mind, here's the evolution of building permits over the last 20 years or so, and then looking forward. So as part of the governor's budget in January, the Department of Finance put out a building permit scenario going forward to 2024. And you can see how Solano County, which is the blue line here, has tracked the black line, which is California. And I made these into indexes that started in the year 2000 to show you the run up during the housing boom, the hard fall during the housing and ultimately the Great Recession, and then the slow gradient evolution over the last 10 years or so, with a downturn in 2020 and 21 as predicted by the Department of Finance because building permits in California might come back much more slowly, and then picking back up again in 22, 23, and 24. Solano County's actually had a really good couple of years in building, and here's the 3 recessions. We're assuming the current recession is going to be declared over sometime soon. So we're not saying the recession is going all the way to 2024 here, but we're expecting actually that blue line to exceed the black in terms of the growth of building permits in Solano County to probably outpace the state toward 2024. We will see, but the last couple of years have been really good. And so I'm showing you this with the idea that part of the housing forecast is because it's a slow evolution here with respect to getting more new units online. Solano County is moving at a little higher pace on the supply side. Okay, let's talk about California with respect to migration. These data are making a lot of news. There's a lot of caveats in what I'm going to show you, but this is the evolution in terms of the number of households that are in net changing their address through the US Postal Service that were in California and left, or were someplace else and came to California. All negative because we've had more people leave than come in. And you can see that 2019 had some of those characteristics. These are from January 2019 forward to January 2021 on a monthly basis. But 2020 really got fast. So part of the issue is, one, we hear about these data in the news, and now we're seeing this. What does this mean? And the answer is we don't know, because we don't have any data other than the fact that these households have changed address. So when you hear about this wild migration out of California, we don't know the composition of those households. We don't know what the labor situation of those households were. And we don't know, in fact, how many people we're talking about. We just know the number of quote unquote households that change address. It could be that 3 people who were in an apartment in Vacaville moved to Fairfield, whilst 3 people in Fairfield moved, 3 families moved from Fairfield to Reno. And in net, the number of households that changed was 3, but a lot more people left than stayed or came in. And so that piece of it, we won't know for another 18 months. So when you hear this news or when you hear these data in the news, be very cautious to believe what they really are telling you in trend. But if you look one level deeper, when people leave California in terms of these household changes, they tend to go to those states, a lot of them West Coast, and they tend to come from those states in terms of coming into California to live. So that's something to watch. Now, with all that said, let's think about going forward. The unexpected inflation is the problem. So I've had probably 25 emails, 10 or so news interviews over the last couple of months. A lot of them want to know what's going on in inflation. Think about it this way. Yes, gas prices are going to go up. So watch for something that's going to probably flirt around $4.50 a gallon here pretty quick in some places around California. I'm actually by Labor Day, get into kind of some weird territory, kind of some 2008-ish, early 2008-ish territory again. The problem with gas prices rising is not so much that we suddenly can't afford the gas. It's going to be on our lower wage workers who are already hurting, because that's a regressive tax for them. And furthermore, it's really when inflation is unexpected that it really hurts not only our lower income households, but it will start to hit bond and equity markets. Bob alluded to this. I'm finalizing the index of economic and community indicators for 2020. This is where so many more details of Solano County are going to come out about not only what's happened in 2020, but what might happen in more detail. So please watch for the County of Solano to release that over the next month and a half. A lot of what I've talked about here alludes to what's in that index, but there's going to be so many more details there if you really want to deep dive into Solano County. The main items are job market looks like it's going pretty good. There's good forecast for housing. Rental is where any nuance in housing is going to happen. It's going to be in rental in the short term. We know that moving Solano forward has got specific goals of both driving higher wage jobs, larger industry employment overall, but also economic diversity. Bob and his team have done a great job thus far, and most likely will continue to do so over the next few years in moving Solano toward that next place. And right now, there's some really good opportunities in there. And the County of Solano did a great job in nuancing how to move through the statewide conditions and keeping a lot of businesses open as essential businesses. Being bold was great, and it's paying off for Solano County as we speak. The things to watch. structural shifts specifically in retail and maybe in travel, depending on how we come back. Places like Vacaville and Visit Vacaville have done a great job in putting people in hotels when they're traveling and really trying to keep those occupancy rates up. It's going to be a wild summer in terms of people wanting to get out, especially if they've been vaccinated. But it's in brick and mortar retail where we really need to watch, and that can bleed into commercial real estate concerns. Restaurant workers, as we come back to quote unquote normal life, we should see a pickup there, but that might again be juxtaposed to lower or slower demand in retail. And we've got to get through the fall and winter and ultimately fire season to really have a clear vision of true recovery. Because if we have fires again, that might be the last straw for people in the region to stick around. And that can change the labor force composition again. But if we have COVID-19 become COVID 20, 21, or 22, depending on how fall and winter go, we will see how that changes social policy in such a way that might reintroduce some conditions that slow down or potentially stop the recovery momentum. We're hoping that does not happen. And of course, we have the specter of drought also floating around in terms of our ag markets and also just thinking about fire season. So we have some caveats, but generally speaking, things look pretty good. So with that, Bob, I'll take some questions if you'd like to moderate. And folks, I really appreciate it. And Bob, I especially appreciate Solano EDC being willing to have me again.
Oh, no, thank you. No, great information. We're really appreciative of it. We're opening to questions on our chat function, but I have the first question. You know, we're all hoping that within the next few months, we really see our economy open up, and there are a lot more opportunities for businesses, especially small businesses, and our economies to really kind of reopen. There's been a lot of information, document studies on how spending behavior right now, and as people have been locked into their homes, has been more on the goods purchasing side rather than experiential. Yep. As the economy opens up and that purchase behavior becomes more experiential, is that being baked into some of the forecasts that we see in inflation in the equity markets and GDP? Because if there is a kind of a hangover effect on goods purchases, could that actually create even a downward shift in, say, the equity markets, or less pressure on inflation?
It could, yes. But in general, what we should expect is we should have continued good forecasts as we shift from the smaller portion of our economy to the larger portion of our economy and get those job markets that have lagged a little bit in terms of showing ultimate recovery momentum picked up. We should see forecasts get a little bit better. The key is that they do. So as we shift more to that, the two major items kind of underneath that umbrella are: one, do we travel in a way that is larger than we would have traveled from a spending standpoint before, or are we a little bit more cautious in the total amount of spending? Mm-hmm. So that's part one. So we get recovery, but it's not full. And then the second is how does that lead to then rehiring, and then getting that sort of second and third level, what we think of as a multiplier effect on spending, because we're getting jobs that weren't there back, those incomes are spending, and we're getting this sort of, you know, like I said, ripple effect on other parts of the economy in such a way that everybody gets picked up. If I went from staying at the Embassy Suites for 5 nights to doing a campground for 5 nights, that's a different spending dynamic. Yeah. So we have people traveling in name is not necessarily spending like they used to. And we should expect higher income folks to spend differently than lower income folks, and maybe even higher income folks spending differently than they would have 18 months ago. So that's what's really going on there if you think about just from the travel side, but that's also true from the restaurant side. Will we see people being willing to spend $250 for 2 people to eat out, or is it going to be more about $100? And we're going to see this kind of price point shift down in restaurants initially, because I'm going to be very cautious about when I go out and where I go out. And then second, I'm going to be cautious about how much I spend in the short term. We will see. But those on the experiential side, those would be the two markets, and kind of some things that are floating out there that might suppress what you think of as sort of a V-shaped recovery. Yeah, we'll see.
Okay. First question from our attendees. Policy question. There's been a lot of talk about forgiving student loans in the amounts of either $10,000 or $50,000. Do you have any thoughts about how this could possibly affect the economy?
Yeah, it's tough to know. The one thing that's positive about it is that it will, at least in theory, provide some incentive for folks to complete degrees that haven't completed them, that are currently experiencing debt, that are in school, but also maybe even draw more people toward higher education, depending on how it's structured with respect to the debt forgiveness. Now, the one thing we need to be very cautious about is making a claim that if you forgive debt, does that open up more windows for people to go to school? And the answer is it might actually close windows in terms of lending, because somebody's going to have to pay the bill in terms of the current outstanding debt if that happens. And I think there's going to be an enormous amount of debate around this in Congress. And people like me are going to be asked to go and speak in front of Congress about exactly the question, Linda, you're asking. The main way to watch, and this will be probably the key debate item, is how does that affect bond markets? And how does that ultimately ripple into equity markets as a result of affecting bond markets? So by saying, okay, all these outstanding bonds that used to be paying interest are now gone, which means the interest payments are gone, which yes, the risk is now gone. And to the consumer, the risk is gone. Does that change consumption patterns for the folks that have forgiven debt in such a way that help the economy? Or does it change bond markets in a way that really rattle equity markets at their foundation? Because now we just don't know what to do with that part of the debt market. So there's a lot of questions still to be answered about how the nuances of such a forgiveness plan would actually affect the broader markets and how big a number we're really talking about.
Well, thank you. Question from Paul Kelly in Vallejo here. And this is about how the talent drain potential and employment capital preservation, how that could be affected by the timing of this recovery, whether it's we have an early recovery, can that help us retain the talent that we have in the state and in the locale?
Absolutely. And as long as it looks like there's a return to living in California and working here, you're going to see people want to stay here. So this, one of the things we're watching closely, and I'll just take it from two angles. One, let's start with the lower wage worker and let's say the services industries that hopefully will come back with strength over the next 12 months. Retaining those folks is going to depend a lot on how California's economy opens up and the way in which people are going to move around the economy and spend. So under the supposition that we go back to something that sounds at least relatively normal with respect to restaurant spending, services spending generally, but also travel spending, will that kind of lift all boats, reinstate jobs, keep wages stable, which then is the true ultimate return to staying in California alongside of all the non-wage benefits you might get from a job, and retain that pool of people who don't see themselves going to higher education and are available sort of this easy entry style of work. The preservation of that labor pool is probably more important than the other piece I'm going to talk about, which is the higher wage, high tech, high education pool, short of medical professionals, which is its own subset. But if you think about what's happened in, let's say, the core Bay Area, and CEOs being relatively liberal with thinking forward and saying, hey, yeah, go ahead and live in Boise, go and live in Nashville, I don't care. Just as long as you've got a really strong internet connection, we'll work it out. If stockholders start to say, well, look, profits are gone down or flattened, and we think as a board and as stockholders that it's because you said that people could live anywhere and they're not as productive as they were coming into South of Market, into the office every day, bring them back or you're out of a job. You might see a real quick retrograde on that hand wavy take that it's okay to live wherever you want if you're an employee of, Google or Twitter, and you just, pick it. You might see some real changes. We will see how that plays out. So the retention of higher wage talent, especially that wrapped around tech and its environs or in science, might depend a lot on how the living situation versus the work situation is California geography specific. The medical profession, we're going to see some real wildness because we moved more toward a telehealth model. You might see more medical professionals, changing where they live, because they can be compensated at more or less the same level, but get a lot more bang for buck. And most of what they're going to do is telehealth, short of emergency health. And we might see some real changes in that industry. We will see, but a lot of those are still very uncertain because we haven't got quite clear of the current situation enough to know how people are going to want to work and live and how the corporate side is going to allow that with respect to their employees.
And you wonder why rural broadband has become such a big topic here in the last 6 months.
Yeah, teleeducation and telehealth are two of the big ones right on top. Absolutely.
That's right. So from Brianna Boyd, basically, is the 1 million jobs lost, is that relatively good or bad compared to the 8 million lost in the US? Is that proportional?
It's proportional. California is about 12% of the national economy. So it's proportional, more or less. And unfortunately, it's all kind of ganged up on 2 or 3 major industries, a lot of them lower wage workers, unfortunately. So yeah, it really does have that much of the nation's unemployment, but a lot of it is boiled into the LA basin, entertainment industry, retail, restaurants, and the tourism environments. And if we see over the next 6 months that the travel industry really pick up, we're going to see those numbers tumble pretty quick. But you should expect some block of that to kind of linger around for a while. And that's why we don't expect full recovery maybe for another 18 months or so, simply because it's going to take what an economist would call, there's still a lot of friction in those markets that needs to be resolved. And until that's resolved in terms of, is there sort of, cyclical change or structural change to those labor markets, when we know that answer, a lot of how large that remains and how California recovers overall will be resolved.
From David Gassaway. So if we're able to, as a nation, to push through this infrastructure bill, will that create some inflationary pressures on construction and housing prices? I mean, of course it will, but to what degree do you think that will have an impact?
It's hard. It's going to be hard to deconstruct how much of that will have an impact versus what we've already spent. So it certainly will exacerbate the pressure, but how that bill rolls out will ultimately tell that tale. Let's say it's $1.2 trillion, just for a number. You should not expect that 1.2 to hit the street in 3 months. It could take 5 or 6 years for that 1.2 to ultimately roll out. And in fact, it's way better for everybody if that's exactly how it plays, given how much spending has already taken place. Bond markets are going to like that story. The inflation forecasts are going to like that story. It's not going to provide as much punch, but it will at least recognize that trying to do all those at once is probably not feasible from a capacity on the labor market standpoint or from the materials market standpoint, because that's where a lot of the inflation kicks, right? It's the idea, okay, if we're going to spend $1.2 trillion and a lot of it's going to be on buying aggregate, on buying labor, on buying steel, iron, what's that going to do to those commodities markets that might upset the balance in other markets where we're not just trying getting the bang for buck? Spreading that over time kind of gives this annual punch that acts as a foundational growth phase every single year. And it also makes everybody expect that to happen. And the more they see it play out, it just helps provide a foundation for growth. So there's going to be some balancing in how that money comes out. It definitely will at least, click up the inflation pressure. Depends on how it's rolled out.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Councilmember Ernest and Dixon. Could you discuss the change in working practices during COVID and the potential shift from bricks and mortar to those working remotely, and how much of that is going to remain long-term or have a long-term effect on land use?
That's a great question. I get a lot of it. So let me kind of tell you where I think things have boiled from what I'm watching. Two things are going on. One is you should expect in the short to medium term continued at least hybrid work situations where you're going in 3 days a week, staying home 2 days a week, under the supposition that you have the flexibility to do that. So let's say the next 12 or 18 months, a lot of jobs that have been work from home over the last 12 months will probably go into a hybrid rather than just snap your fingers and next week everybody's going back 5 days a week. And we're going to see how it goes most places. Now, the good thing about that is that it kind of preserves the investment in commercial real estate, because if you're asking people to come back 3 days a week, you might as well, it's going to have the same sort of characteristics as asking them to do 5 with respect to the physical capital piece. So from a brick and mortar office standpoint, as long as there's a hybrid situation, that should at least preserve some of the investment that's been made. Whether or not you see tenants looking to price down a little bit under the supposition they're only going to be there 3/5 of the time and are going to want to work with the landlord with the credible threat that they could go to 0. We'll see how that changes leasing prices, but expect that there's going to be at least a short to medium term shift. The long-term shift is all going to boil down to productivity. If the perceived productivity is strong under either scenario, then you're probably going to see some divestiture of the physical space because there won't be as much need for it, or at least some trying to price down, which will change the revenue structure for owners, unfortunately, if you're a commercial real estate owner. But that's something that productivity will ultimately play out how long-term that really is.
Okay. We have a lot of questions.
Yeah, we do.
We're gonna have to take a nap after this one. How are the logistics bottlenecks taking place at our ports in different locations affecting inflation? Do you believe what impact?
Yeah, I mean, generally they affect it in short-term burst ways rather than, let's say, trended ways. So, for example, I just got this question earlier today. What happened when the Suez Canal craziness took place? Does that not lead to some weirdness in commodities markets, in goods markets, and even in somewhat in services because of how they're connected in a supply chain fashion? The answer is it is if there's if there's a structural shock or a longer term shock. 6 or 7 days difference in logistics markets is not going to change a whole lot, because if you change prices and then everybody says, okay, I'm going to slow down my demand, and you've got all this built up inventory coming, what you don't want people doing is saying, okay, you raise prices on me, now I'm going to slow down my demand, and I've got 2 months worth of stuff already on the water coming to an unknown market. You kind of want to say, okay, we're just going to kind of wiggle through this. If the Suez Canal had stopped working, and this is something to think about from a geopolitical standpoint that might unfortunately be brewing somewhere, is it, and using what happened recently as an example of what you might be able to do to change economic fortunes. If the Suez Canal closed for 2 or 3 months, then you would see a shock, right? But the fact that you could still go around the Horn of Africa, it only lasted about 7 or 8 days in grand scheme of things, and goods markets kind of kicked right back in again. You shouldn't worry too much about those bottlenecks globally. At the local level, things can get a little bit dicey if you're not having smooth transition. So as we pick up our demand, we need to make sure that our ports are working well, and that our transportation networks are working well. The cool thing about this transition is it's actually expanded our use of last mile networks and made us a little more efficient across the board. So we're hoping that when bottlenecks take place, and the key is that they're not medium and long term in their nature. That's where you get some weird price dynamics. In short term, you're going to have, much you hate to say this, but you're just going to have that.
Yeah. So this is more of a practitioner's question, and I'm going to rephrase this. Is it possible to do an outlook forecast per city? Is there just enough data out there to be able to do that?
You can a little bit, but the data are a little tricky to find from an official standpoint. And I don't really recommend outlooks per city, because there's very few cities, except for the major cities in major metropolitan areas, that really drive what's going on regionally. So it's not like, let's say you can't really take a city like Rio Vista and say, okay, here's the outlook for Rio Vista, because not only do the data not really exist to do something that's with actual precision, Rio Vista is a little bit small to really say that it's not going to be basically driven by what's happening, let's say, in the county overall. So if you look at what we put out in the index for economic and community indicators with respect to the county, that's going to give you a real good feel about the cities in Solano County.
Okay. Here's a really interesting question. So buyers are spending a lot more on housing right now. Prices are going up. Who's losing out? Is the money that's spent on housing now, is that pulling money out of basic commerce, goods, products, services, and is that affecting basically our economy?
Yeah, I mean, the two main negatives are, one is that if people are no longer renting and they've purchased, then the multifamily owners that now have vacancy left behind and they can't easily fill it will lose revenue. And that's part one. Most people take wealth that was already committed somewhere in the equity markets or some other market and then make that the down payment on housing. So that's not a big deal. And if the cost of housing in rental is more or less the same, maybe a little bit more in buying, and that's really the key, that the core of your question boils down to that difference. If now you're spending $1,000 more per month on housing because you made that change, the after-tax spending you're making, if that's changed, then yes, it does pull out of goods and services. But generally, people do not make huge leaps that last for a long time in terms of the difference between what they were renting at and what they'd have to buy, without having already plotted through keeping their consumption level relatively similar. For example, every time I bought a home, my real estate agent said, well, I guess you're just going to have to be eating rice and beans for a year. So it is what it is. And it's like, okay, great. Thanks a lot. But at the end of the day, after I bought a home or I moved to another home, while that looked like it was happening on the surface, my consumption pattern really didn't change that much. Now, that might just be me as using one data point, but I think generally speaking, people go through that rational thought in their mind that, do I want to buy a home and then go down to half of what I was consuming before, or am I looking to balance it? Thus, I'm not going to go from a home that cost me $2,000 a month to rent to $6,000 plus to purchase, because where am I going to find the money otherwise? And what does that mean to my lifestyle? So
Okay.
generally speaking, it shouldn't lead to a whole lot of difference.
Okay. We're going to have one more question here, if that's
Cool.
okay with you.
Yeah, and Bob, real quick, if I have the chat from this, so what I can do based on who you are is I'll try to match that up and send some of the answers to Bob, and then Bob can just, send out to the list the
Fantastic.
answers to those questions if that works for everybody. And I'm sorry we didn't quite get to those today.
Yeah, no, happy to be a conduit for
Cool.
that. So, and this is a really interesting question, and I'm getting asked a lot about it on a daily basis. And I know there's a lot of consultants and a lot of academics working on this. Basically, we've lost a lot of small businesses in the country, and here many are barely surviving. I guess everybody's looking for that answer. What's permanent, what's not? And I think that there's an additional question too, because small businesses, especially food services industry, are already risky. They say isn't a number that people say roughly 50% of all restaurants go out of business within the first couple years of opening in a good economy.
Yeah, and like 90% don't make it after 3 or 4, supposedly. There's a lot of numbers get thrown around. Yeah.
So is there a way to really find the impact of COVID on these restaurants and what the true damage is from COVID, and will that help us sort of on our recovery plan? And I think part of this we're going to be diving into with our Moving Solano Forward 3 plan that we were just funded by the EDA. So I'll let you take it.
Sure. So once we see the volume of taxable sales, specifically, let's say in the restaurant industry, get back up to where it was before COVID-19 started, and then we look around to see how many restaurants actually survived, that's where you're going to know, because you're going to say, okay, the demand side has now basically come back. What's the composition of the supply side? And have we seen larger businesses soak up that new demand? Or have we seen entrepreneurship come in, which is possible, to find gaps to where, yes, the number of businesses has gone down, but the number of new businesses trying to fill gaps that were left behind while we were waiting to climb back up and trend to that number have come back in. And is this, in a sense, portend to seeing more entrepreneurism to fill in, let's say, cuisine gaps? For example, if an Italian place closes, does it lead to 2 new Italian places that come in after demand has come back because they want to take less risk and they know that one Italian restaurant left it behind? That's key. So not only could we, on an opportunity side, actually get a better mix of businesses, but I shouldn't say better mix. I should say a broader mix of businesses that cover a broader array of services and types of service. But we might get ones that are more stable because of the lessons learned from this recession, and also sort of being born based on new demand and actually looking to contest markets rather than doing it on spec. And maybe the market will come back. When demand gets back up, you might see a lot more entrepreneurism looking to fill gaps that were left behind. But that would be where I would start to look and say, when we get to X number that's equal to what it was pre-COVID, let's look now at